Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're really looking forward to this event. We're going to give everybody a little bit of time to come in to the event. We've got quite a few people signed up, and it takes a little while for everybody to log on. So we'll just give it a few minutes before we kick everything off. Everybody's coming in now. So we appreciate you joining us on such a lovely evening. It feels like a spring evening here in the Hudson Valley. She says, hopefully, before we get another frost.
It's about time.
Yes,
it's raining in Oregon, so you know.
Is it?
Oh. It's been beautiful, but we've had the whole hail and sun and just really, the spastic spring weather.
Oh, right. And all of that rain. Well, you get a lot of rain in Portland anyway, don't you? Generally
I think speaking. It's good. It's good for the writing.
Yeah, it is. Good and for your skin. It's great for your skin. All right, we've got a good bunch of people in here now. I'm going to kick off with my introduction, and people can roll in as we go. So I'm Helen Sosowski of Oblong Books in New York's Hudson Valley. For those of you who don't know the store, thank you for joining us this evening. We have a very special event with author Erica Berry, who's celebrating her new book, WOLFISH, and she's going to be in conversation with Sharon Charde. WOLFISH has been named a most anticipated book of 2023 by Vulture, Salon, Bustle, The Rumpus, The Financial Times, and more. And in it, Erica has deftly blended science, history, and cultural criticism in a years-long journey to understand our myths about wolves. And in the book, she also tracks one legendary wolf, OR7, from the Wallowa Mountains of Oregon. If you'd like to order a copy of WOLFISH, you can do so on our website, oblongbooks.com, and I'll post a link in the chat once the event is underway that you can order it from. And if you're not from the Hudson Valley, then please order it from your local independent bookstore. We appreciate that. Before I introduce our guests, a reminder, there'll be a Q&A after the conversation, and you can leave your questions in either the chat or at the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Erica Berry is joining us this evening from her hometown of Portland, Oregon. She has an MFA from the University of Minnesota, where she was a College of Liberal Arts Fellow. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, the New York Times Magazine, the Yale Review, Outside Magazine, Catapult, The Atlantic, Guernica, and elsewhere. She is the winner of the Steinberg Essay Prize and the Kurt Brown Prize in Nonfiction, and has received fellowships and funding from the Breadloaf Writers Conference, Tin House, the UCross Foundation, the Minnesota State Arts Board, and the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources. A former writer-in-residence with the National Writers Series in Traverse City, Michigan, she's currently a writer in the schools with literary arts in Portland. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you so much.
Sharon Charde has 7 published poetry collections, the most recent being The Glass is Already Broken, which was published by Blue Light Press in 2021. She has also taught incarcerated girls poetry for 16 years and wrote a memoir about that work, I Am Not a Juvenile Delinquent, which was published by Mango in June of 2020. She's received many awards for her poetry, including 10 Pushcart nominations and numerous fellowships, among them Yaddo, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, UCross and McDowell Foundation. A retired psychotherapist, Sharon lives in Northwest Connecticut with her husband of 58 years. Welcome to you both. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. And Sharon, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Oh, this is such a treat. One of the joys of artist residencies, and you heard that both Erica and I have done a number of them, is to spend time with writers who are in the process of writing a book and being present to that process, hearing snippets of the book, and then much later seeing the actual finished product. And it is a real thrill for me to see this book and have this conversation tonight. And thank you, Oblong, my longtime wonderful bookstore that I've been involved with for nearly 50 years now, for hosting us. Erica and I met at the UCross Foundation on a 22,000 acre ranch in Wyoming. In the few weeks we were there together, we formed such a close bond. Long walks in those wide open spaces nearly daily forged a strong connection as we spoke of so many themes in her book, many dear to both of our hearts. Erica, tell us what you remember about those long walks. As I recall, they had so much to do with the women's issues about which I am passionate. And though we're so different in our ages, I'm like 3 times as old as you are. And it's so amazing to me that someone as young as you are has achieved so much. I can't imagine what you will have achieved by the time you're my age. My God, the description of you will be too big to fit on any in any flyleaf of any book. So we're
yeah. I mean, those walks, Sharon, you are selling yourself short because it was such a joy. It's such a joy to be in conversation with you here, and it's the time of day when we would walk, right, where we'd been working, and we would go out on this dirt road where there was no cell service. And I think, you know, having grown up with family in Montana and places like this, you go on a run or a walk on a dirt road with no cell service, and you're sort of aware that there's maybe mountain lions or bears, but you're also aware, we were told to wear orange all the time so we wouldn't get shot, if you remember. It was hunting season.
I do.
And so there was this sort of edge, like, how could we not be talking in some way about what it meant to have a mortal body and to be walking through the wilderness with it, right? Which is so much. And you sort of think about animals and you think about two-legged animals, right? And I think that question of how to grow older beside a body that will die and being around other bodies who are vulnerable was very much the question that is at the heart of so much of your poetry that's so wonderful. Those of you who don't know Sharon's poetry, I really think we circle the same themes, what a friend of mine calls kind of big feelings, which I think are these questions of love and terror and grief, and essentially like what it means to drag a body through the world and to create art and beauty amidst what is really scary sometimes, right? And I think that question of how we live beside that which is scary outside of ourselves and also inside of ourselves was always that intimacy of conversation, right? And I think comes to, again, what I was thinking about in this book, like sometimes we're scared of things out there, but sometimes it's these like feelings inside ourselves that we don't know how to confront. So it's an honor to be in conversation with you today.
Oh, absolutely. The spaciousness that we were in, I can feel it now as we're talking. I mean, we were so small and it was so big.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the power of our conversation and our thoughts and feelings were so connected in this vast space, which for me was very new. I'm a New England girl. I hadn't been to Wyoming before, but I know you will talk about this later in the hour, but you are much more used to that kind of spaciousness than I was. So it was just a triple, quadruple treat. I think we talked about having you start with reading a bit of the book so people can sort of get their feet wet with it. And then I have a number of questions which I've written down, and hopefully we can get to most of them. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A with the audience. So let's start with you reading from the book.
I'm just going to start from the initial pages of the book. Actually, I haven't read this yet in a reading, but I think feel free to close your eyes if you're listening. This is one of those stories that begins with a female body. Hers was crumpled, roadside, in the ash-colored slush between asphalt and snowbank, eyes open and facing the road, a gaze that seemed to demand reciprocity. See me. Or at least that was what I told myself when I could not look away from the photograph, unable to close the tab on my computer, unable to blink away the wolf. She was 2 years old, a lone wolf, the Oregon State Police report said. OR 106, the 106th wolf biologist collared in Oregon. She would have left her nearby pack for the normal reasons, looking for a mate or new territory, and how could she have known her journey would end so soon on a road 6 miles outside Wallowa, a town of about 800 people in northeastern Oregon? A concerned citizen notified authorities of her presence at 10:36 a.m. on the cool, clear morning of January 8th, 2022. In the photograph, the police circulated on Twitter with a seeking public assistance hashtag. She looks small, her legs slim. The fur on her belly is the color of cream, her tail a brush dipped in ink, a ridge of black painting her spine to her ears. Her body is the same palette as the snow beneath her, but her winter coat is plush and glossy, no signs of trauma or blood, the GPS collar a golden ring around her neck. Nearly 10 days after her death, I will think of her while watching the swelling glow of a yellow moonrise. The full moon is often called a wolf moon in January because it's the time of year that wolves are thought to be hungriest. Hunger, said that old French proverb, drives the wolf from the wood. I hoped OR 106 had not died with a gnaw in her belly. But how had she died? By the placement of her body, you would think her death was by car, and I wonder if that's what the passerby thought when they raised the flag of alert that Saturday morning. A wolf being killed by a car could mean bad luck. Maybe someone leaving the bar too late, blood already toxic as they wove through the forest. I can almost imagine in such a situation how a driver could panic, swearing in a frozen cloud of whiskey breath as they stepped onto the road to investigate the bump, unable to stand sentry as the wolf's breath slowed, or maybe just unable to pick up the phone and call the collision in. I play this out in my head as if it will help me understand her death, but it doesn't matter because OR 106 wasn't killed by a car, the subsequent investigation found. She was killed by a gun, a human with a gun, poached. The root of the Greek word for forgetting, lethe, suggests an act of hiding. We could extend the image and say that to forget is to bury, writes Lewis Hyde in a primer for forgetting. In this case, there would be two sorts of burials, one in which something is covered up and forgotten because we can't stand to look at it, and another because something has been revealed and examined and may be covered up for good. In the second form of forgetting, rites have been observed. Maybe that was why I could not close the tab on my computer. I wanted to make sure OR 106 could have the right kind of burial, if only in my mind. I wanted to bring her body rest. I'll stop there for now.
I had another question for this part of our talk, but I'm wondering if I should jump to the one about tell us about your deeply felt connection to OR7. And since you've just introduced her, is it a she?
Well, this was actually another wolf, but I'm happy to talk about.
Another wolf. Okay.
They all have similar confusing names.
Oh, okay. Okay, well then maybe I'll go back to the question that I was going to ask next. One of the things you do so skillfully in this book is to weave so many strands together. Your life experiences, fairy tales, women's issues, an extraordinary amount of literary reference. I was just incredibly impressed with important environmental issues, the story of OR7, and so much about wolves in general. It's be a huge challenge for any writer. How were you able to do that? And why did you feel it was necessary to do that for the life of your story?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a beautifully said question. And I don't know about you, but I'm one of those readers that is always reading like 5 books at a time. You have the book of poetry and the novel and the science explore, a book like Ed Yong's new book, or something like that, a history book. And in those themes and ideas and genres are always mingling internally, right? Like they're casting light on each other. And there's these feedback loops happening, right? Where I go to one book having just read the other. And I think I wanted to try to write a book that really had that engine of associative power, because it feels like when I say wolf, like anyone in this chat would have a different association of what wolf represents. And so often I felt like I was told, we'll write about the wolf just biologically, like that's what's important. Humans have projected so much on this animal. And I thought, I can't even untangle that, because to write about the biology of the wolf is to write about like the taxonomist who decided a wolf is a wolf and a dog is a dog. And that speaks to sort of various European perspectives and settler perspectives. And like, even that is not a thing, is a thing worth dismantling in a certain way. And so I just felt like, to talk about this topic, I needed to sort of expand the door. And I think I became interested, this project started as my environmental studies thesis when I was in college. And I certainly went in thinking I was going to write this sort of cool narrative nonfiction book where I'd be like driving in my car and just interviewing people and be a sort of fly on the wall narrator. And then I had a couple of experiences, first in sort of a bar in Eastern Oregon where I was interviewing a local about wolves, and a man who was somewhat inebriated came over and wanted to talk, because he could tell we were outsiders. And he said, "What are you studying?" It came out that it was wolves. And his response, something flipped, right? If he'd been sort of like curiously flirtatious, quickly he became extremely aggressive and was sort of like, it's really obvious what we have to do with wolves. And he mimed shooting up the bar. And there's something about being there at the other side of a man making a gun with his hands, where it became so obvious to me, if it wasn't already, that the wolf was conjuring so much outside of itself, and that I also was in that story, right? And I think, again, I think about these other moments of essentially feeling afraid as a young woman reporting. I'm thinking I'm just going to tell the story of my reporting, and then I'm running into someone on a train or having these experiences where I would think about myself and think about Little Red Riding Hood. I didn't want to think about Little Red Riding Hood, and felt like there's the symbolism of the wolf is as tied to what is actually happening on a policy level. So that is to say, I think that the symbolic stories became intertwined with my pursuit of the real wolf. And I also will say, like, I was not a young person who would have read a book about wolves. I didn't consider myself an animal person when I started this book. I loved animals, but I don't think I felt like that wolf books, they were written for somebody else that wasn't me. And I was interested in the idea of writing a wolf book that might be able to appeal to people who wouldn't think they would necessarily want a wolf book. I think, like, thinking about this book that's so kind of omnivorous across genres as a bit of a Trojan horse, where there's something maybe for, you're getting feminism when you think you're just getting ecology, and vice versa. And hopefully that's giving openings for other people to come to the table in this sense.
Yeah, you snuck a lot in there for people who maybe were thinking they were just going to read about wolves.
I
And
know.
speaking of
Surprise.
that, Little Red Riding Hood, or Little Red as you call her, I love that, Little Red. That's such a cool way of saying, of shortening her name. What influence did her story have on your life? And as I say here, as I say in my thoughts and my question here, in light of being brought up in a very crunchy, environmentally conscious Portland, Oregon, though, and when you and I were talking the other day, I said you had so much credibility, much more credibility than somebody just writing the kind of stuff you're writing about without the background of both grandparents. I guess one grandparent, one set of grandparents were sheep ranchers, and the other one lived on a farm. And so you spent a lot of time with those people who seem to be extremely important in your life. And on how lucky you were to have that experience. I mean, lucky in all ways in your growing up years and with these wonderful grandparents and those experiences. Tell us about those as you do in the book, but give us
Yeah.
people a little taste of that.
Well, yeah, I think, it wasn't a thing I thought about when I started researching wolves, the degree to which I sort of had experiences with my grandparents in Montana of hearing wolves as they would circle the house. And they had horses when I was growing up. And like, we would be able to see the horses scared. There was one day where the wolves came up to the horse enclosure and the tracks were in the snow, right? And so that feeling of walking outside and feeling like, oh, I'm glad they didn't get a dog, it wasn't abstract to me, and at the same time, all my grandparents were conservationists and taught me so much about hiking in wild spaces and appreciating the names. I had a grandfather who was a botanist, and everyone like knowing the names of plants and their sort of interconnectivity. So I think I understood, even though wolf dynamics were often talked about from what I saw, the sort of most simplistic media portrayals were like, it's urban folks who are pro-wolf and rural people hate wolves. And that's the most simplistic idea. And it's just so much more complicated than that. And that's true both, intimately, I recognize that, but also with so many of the producers I talked to or people, who I was interviewing. So I think, my grandfather who has sheep, he wasn't a full-time rancher, but he had a sheep farm in the Willamette Valley. And like my father has memories of sheep being attacked by coyotes and like having to sew them back together. And that's a really intense thing, and I didn't want to think about the wolf without also thinking about where its life intersects with these bodies that you're caring for, perhaps as a producer. And at the same time, the wolf isn't doing that out of cruelty. The wolf isn't doing that to create harm. And so holding both of those realities. To get back to Little Red, I go back, I did have this very crunchy sort of Portland progressive upbringing. And I went to a hippie camp when I was, I think, a 6th grader that was in this field outside Eugene, Oregon, for that, if that name rings anything to people on the call. And it was like, we were eating all this tofu salad and, our activities were like putting a tampon in water to watch it. Like it was really not your average summer camp. And I was sort of miserable part of the time, but I do remember that we were sort of indoctrinated with, the narrative that was told us was that the boys were out to get us. And it was a female only empowerment camp, girls only at the time. And I did not trust that idea. I think I was so lucky to have not experienced male violence, privileged in like systemic ways, to have not experienced male violence as a young girl. And so the idea that I was just supposed to enter the world waiting for predation and this conflation of women with victimhood, I had not, this is the first time it sort of hit home for me, right? I kind of came of age in this girl power 2000s, very particular to my white girlhood, of course, this narrative that I could do anything and that people would protect me and would stand up for me, right? And I think, there was something deeply uncomfortable about understanding. Maggie Nelson describes it as sometimes a woman feels like she's born already dead. And I think there is a sense that you feel like victimhood is your future if that's the narrative. And so I became interested in sort of breaking down these dynamics of predator and prey. I didn't trust the ways that cultural creation of the predator, right? We all know that just because somebody's seen as a predator does not make them safe, does not give them power, right? Being feared does not make you powerful, can make you more vulnerable. And at the same time, wanted to break down and sort of dismantle those ideas of prey, like Little Red, who, by the way, Charles Dickens said that if he could have married Little Red Riding Hood, he would have had a perfect life, which is so, wow. I don't know, there's something about, I began to see in the story Little Red Riding Hood. Yeah, I quote it and I don't give any context, so I don't actually know what it's from, but it was just a line that jumped out to me insofar as like, this is a story that codifies a certain version of the wolf in sort of main dominant Western perceptions, this idea of wolf as predatory man. But I think it also does so much for this idea of girl as victim who's sort of foolish, right? And this idea that like you need a counterweight. The wolf is only as bad as the girl is innocent. And I sort of have quotes around all of that, right? And yeah, you know, Sarah Ahmed says that violence hovers around the deviant, and Little Red Riding Hood is and isn't deviant, right? She's this like young white blonde girl who's very adored and people want to protect her. And I think that speaks to a certain who is allowed to be victim in our society. Like in this one story, I felt like there was so much that had sort of trickled through these generations that spoke not only to how we live with these ideas of fear, but even in our own bodies. And so thinking about my own sort of portrayal or girlhood became as important as looking at who the wolf was symbolically, because I think they're sort of tied. Yeah, there's a link between the evil wolf and the innocent girl, and I didn't trust either portrayal.
I actually, when I was reading your book and I was reading the whole part about Little Red, I have an old copy of my Grimm's fairy tales from when I was a little girl, and I grabbed it from the shelf and I looked at the story, and you know, all those stories we were told, and the wolf, I mean, you humanize the wolf. I mean, I like so many of us have always thought of the wolf as being a scary thing, and I am certainly not aware. I don't have your environmental awareness at all of, you know, I mean, I know the wolves have been both protected and hated, you know, by ranchers in the parks out west and so forth, but you just teach us so much about the wolf. But I do digress.
I will say, because it's suddenly very obvious in my screen, like I'm currently, my studio is the old studio of a visual artist who did children's books. And so there's this sort of, her painted drop cloths are behind me. You can see these like paint spatters everywhere. But she also left this drawing that it's, to me, seems like it's a portrait from Little Red Riding Hood. It's a wolf going to this house through a forest. And it was just on the wall when I arrived. And so I do think like the ways that story in our DNA, there's this French phrase that I began to sort of like, I actually heard it from someone first at a residency, speaking of like the beauty of residencies, and pardon my French because my pronunciation's not good, but this idea of entre chien et loup, which is the idea between a dog and a wolf, which kind of speaks to this twilight hour when you cannot tell if the figure before you is a dog or a wolf, if you're right to be afraid. But I think in that moment of seeing the wolf, there's also potentially a moment of intrigue and excitement, right? And is this creature going to act in ways that I understand, or are they going to kind of go off script and not be familiar? And that idea of how we evaluate our fears began to feel really central to me. And that base is not only based on how we evaluate live time, what we see before us, right? But the stories we've been told. If I've been told that wolves are a threat, or that I'm going to face danger when I go out in the world, that's what I'm going to find, right? I'm going to be like seeing the world through that lens. And I think one of the questions that became sort of one of the driving factors for this book was, I felt like if I can't change the sort of patriarchal and other systemic dangers in the world that I'm bumping into and are making it challenging to feel brave, if I can't change can I change those external factors? Or is it just that I have to change my own mindset? Because I went through a period very hypervigilant after a few of these, I guess, you know, assaults on the spectrum of that with strangers, and didn't know how other people seemed to be braver at moving through the world than I was. So this book was very much written from a place of urgency and like trying to figure out how people lived beside all that is uncertain, which in so many ways, Little Red Riding Hood is a story of a mother who knows there is threat and sends her daughter out anyway, right? She says, like, be careful, this thing might be scary, but still go. And I wanted to protect that instinct. This go out, go walk alone in the woods. Yes, something can happen, but it's not worth staying inside. Like, I very much think we should be out in the forest, and yet acknowledging there's that fear. And by forest, I guess I mean the metaphor.
Okay, well, that leads me perfectly into my next question, but I just want to say that I think from listening to Erica's responses to the few questions I've asked so far, you can see how wide-ranging the subject matter of her book is, and how you're gonna have to go back, as I did, and reading it. There's so much in it. There's so many quotes and so much material. I had to go back. It's almost like I was back in school again, and kind of reread it to be sure I was getting it all, because there's just so much stuff. So here's a simple, well, it's not such a simple question, really. It's a simple question, but the answer is very complicated, I think, or will be. What should a parent tell a child, Little Red Riding Hood's mother today? What should a parent tell a child about entering a scary world, especially in light of how terrifying our world is today for kids with all this gun violence? And what did your parents tell you? That's two questions.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had, the perfect answer in some way. I do think
All you can do is explore it. There is no perfect answer.
exactly. Well, and having sat through, when I was teaching high school, we had a lockdown at my school, and the experience of sitting through it, and there was no live shooter, it turns out, nearby. So it was kind of a false alarm, I guess. Which did and didn't matter, right? Like the experience of sitting in a classroom locked with students who think that this is happening is so terrifying, and made me think about the ways that so many experiences of fear in the world, it's like, oh, well, things actually went okay. I had this experience being grabbed on the street by a strange man at night, and someone intervened. And I later was like, well, it could have been much worse. So therefore, like, how do we talk about it, right? And I think at the same time, those moments, it's really bad just to have the thing happen, right? And writing into those kind of gray areas of fear feel really important to me now. So I think there's something to be said for like validating that, validating the horror of even lockdown drills, even lockdowns, like those are traumatic, even if you're not there with a shooting, right? Students are being just like, yeah, just like Little Red is told to be the one to protect herself. It's her duty to stay on the path. It's the child's duty to know where to hide during the drill, right? We're teaching it all wrong. And I do think, I go back to, I interviewed a biologist who studies the ecology of fear, and she applies PTSD context from humans to animals and looks at how fear exists in animal bodies. And it was really interesting for me to think about myself as an animal in those moments where I'd had these sort of freeze, fear, flight responses. And she said, a plant, an animal, a person, you're a different body immediately after you experience something scary. We have these fear responses. It's our duty to stay alive. Of course, we change. And fear is not an emotion in my lab, she said. It's a set of responses. There's these sort of dominoes, right, that affect our behavior. And for some reason, that was helpful for me too, because I felt like I was trying to think about what was rational or irrational. And really, like, we're animals and we're experiencing threat. And the world becomes a little smaller after that, right? Animals that are afraid will not feed as widely. They will have fewer children. Like it carries this toll on us. But I also think fear, like studying fear in animals, did give me these other insights into fear in humans, like the idea that fear can be a source of inquiry and provocation and like curiosity, like the unknown, the sense of just living a life where everything is controlled. That wasn't appealing to me ever either. And that, you can be scared even as you walk out the door, and that's still important to walk out the door.
Is that what you would tell a child? Is that something like what you would tell a child?
Well, no, I mean, I think the gun issue, I'm so frustrated because it's, the systemic issues actually do feel fixable with that in a way, right? Like we could have better legislation that would make it safer for children to be in school in
Yeah.
a way that, like, I can't prevent anyone getting in a car crash. It's still scary to send a child out in a car knowing that they could get in a crash, right? And yet, like, there's these differences there.
Well, some people have described, I know you don't have children, but I obviously do, and probably many of the people watching us do, as having your heart walking along outside of your body. And your child is so precious, and we want, one of the driving desires of a parent is to protect, or what you're supposed to do, what you want to do, what you hope you can do is to protect your child. And the world is a scary place. I mean, it's a scarier place now than it was when my children were young. But I think it's a tremendous challenge to be able to speak to your child about giving them both, as your parents gave you the confidence to go out into the world, into a world that that they need, and also at the same time to be prepared for frightening things to happen. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and I think, I used to think it was sort of, we could eradicate the fear. And I think, again, like with gun violence, we can. That's in our control. It's so frustrating. But I've learned, writing this book, like, there's no conclusion to how we live with fear, except to say that we learn how to walk beside it, and we learn when to sort of discard. Philippe Petit, the high wire artist, has this quote that, like, fear is an absence of knowledge. Again, it's hard to bring it all back to lockdowns, because I think those fears are so rational and so grounded that
They're real.
it collapses. But his idea, like, people, for example, with wolves, you're more likely to be killed by cows or falling ladders or vending machines or autoerotic asphyxiation. There's this whole list of things that kill more people than wolves. And so it is important to sort of be able to, we have to tell ourselves certain stories, and not just all the bad ones, right? Not just all the local news stories that are selling us fear to make us scared, right? I think fear is a story culturally that is often told by people in power to distract from other things. And I think we see this with, like, even in pre-industrial Europe, the idea of wolf hunts were sort of created to distract from income inequality or these plagues or all of these more systemic issues. It was like, no, the wolf is the problem. Let's go kill the wolf. And I think there are you do see that in certain narratives about fear that talk about this idea of, like, the scary predator outside our door. That's a distraction sometimes from the worst fears, right? Which are housing insecurity and any of these other things.
I was so struck by your compassion. Like, we've talked about this, your compassion for your predators and wolves. I thought you were actually going to jump into the enclosure with them when you were at that place in England, and that preserve. And I was scared to death by your compassion for these men that were preying on you, and you thought about them instead of being more self-protective. That was one of the most, I think the personal stuff in the book was really powerful for me. But that, I'm like, this guy is banging on your door of your apartment, and you're thinking about, oh my God, is he white? Is he black? Am I gonna, is he gonna maybe go to jail? And I'm worried about that instead of, like, getting on 911. So I guess I guess my question, another big one, is what did you learn and process about yourself during and after writing this book?
I mean, I think my editors, from Queens, and she at one point said, like, it's so funny reading it because she has these different reactions. Like when someone sits down next to me on the train and I sort of become very people pleasy, like I have to talk to him. She was like, no, you like, you know, you walk up, you give him the finger, you shout at him. And I just didn't have that impulse. And it became as interesting to me that I didn't.
And you had that creep sitting next to you on the train.
Yeah, I had a bad situation. And I think, you know, I realized I was mimicking sort of the friendliness my father shows towards strangers, or so there's like the naivete baked into this.
Father is a man.
An optimism, exactly, about how the world is. But I also think it goes back to the idea that, like, I am not always just a victim. Like, I have certain the privileges socioeconomically, or like able-bodied. I'm someone who people believe, who the police are more likely to believe if I say there's a problem, right? And I think it became a moment to consider all of those. It's just too simple to say someone's the villain and someone's the victim in these situations, and there's these other dynamics. And
When you're right in the middle of it, are you thinking that really?
I mean, maybe there is a valid question of like, has my memory of the event, you know, is it accurate? But I do remember, like, when I was being sort of attacked on the sidewalk, I thought, okay, you have the pepper spray this man, slap this man. But he was kind of crying. He was saying, everybody hates me, you love me, you left me. He like was confused. And I think because it was clear that he was intoxicated, maybe dealing with addiction, or maybe mentally unwell, like, I didn't feel comfortable punching him or I mean, I've never punched anyone in my life. But I think it did raise these questions of like, what do I do? You know, the idea of just, you have a threat and you expel it and remove it, and that solves the problem, is a sort of, that's what the sort of myth of incarceration is, but that's not fixing anything. And I guess I'm like, my interest in sort of these more like restorative justice, like the whole picture, like what has led this person to do this. Maybe at the moment, I mean, my body was just so shocked in the moment, but I do think also as a woman, I received this training on caring for others, and I was surprised how strong that was, right? Like, on the one hand, it was this really strong reflex of like, protect yourself. And on the other, it was like, are you being too judgmental? Are you being too quick to come to conclusions? This person has clearly had a hard life. Like, should you be furthering that? And so I wanted to, at least in the context of the book, strip back that kind of scaffolding behind that, so that people can consider in their own life, when they've had a moment where it maybe feels like it's just a black and white, I'm doing everything right and this person's harmful, like, what is behind that harm? And yeah, I mean, in some way it makes me think to go back to the idea of wolves again, which is sort of like how my brain is associating now between humans and wolves, right? And I think I talked to a biologist who was following this big wolf that was like the wolf that was the kind of, not alpha wolf, but like the head of the pack, a really big male wolf. And one day he gets to a field of snow and the wolf is dead in the middle of the field and surrounded by a ring of blood. And he was trying to figure out like, what has caused this wolf to die. And he sees that there's like one hole in the wolf, and it was that it had been skewered by the antlers of a big elk, and the elk had spun this wolf around and flung it somewhere. And what the biologist told me is, he was like, the prey has to have more credit. Like, the prey can be pretty powerful too. And I think it made me realize that in that case, the prey became the predator, right? The elk killed the wolf. And I'm not saying that in moments where I felt like predated upon, that I was also the predator, but I think I did want to sort of like muddy those experiences of writing into fear and recognizing this complexity, which is uncomfortable. But I also feel like in me showing, well, here's some of the ways that that my body exists in the world in ways that have privilege or something, it maybe I want the readers to be able to consider that too, and men who might not think of themselves as scary to be able to say, oh, here's what else is going on, for example. So
that was something. I have a feeling we're getting close to the end here, but that, speaking of what you were just saying, tell me about, you told me a little bit, or tell everybody about some of the reactions of the men that have read this book seems very relative to what you were just saying. What have their reactions been, and your reaction to their reaction? And Helen, you better, I'm not watching the time, and I don't know if Erica is, but I
I
think
think
You're fine. You're fine. Just, it's a great discussion. Just, you can go to questions whenever you feel comfortable doing so. It's a great discussion. Continue, please.
okay, we'll continue.
I think that the best, kind of most surprising conversation I had recently was with a livestock producer who I interview in the book, who said that he was reading it and he was really caught by the sociological construction of wolves I was writing about. And he's a man who has had a lot of wolf kills of livestock and dogs. So I anticipated that those would be the scenes that would resonate with him, these moments of real wolves. In fact, he was thinking about the symbolic wolves, and he said, I realized that I was a wolf in my youth. And to me, this was this example where he started talking about a woman in his life who'd experienced violence from an intimate partner, and domestic violence. And like, he was reconciling these forms of patriarchal violence openly on the phone in ways that I was so honored, I think, that he was vulnerable enough to read himself into the text in that way. And I think that's true with many of the letters I've gotten from men who are sort of who are saying things like, I didn't understand. I never thought about running at night. I love running at night. And I felt like, as the recipient of those notes, I'm like, yes, I feel like sometimes, you're watching other people, like the off-leash dogs in the dog park, and you're like the dog that's like can't go anywhere. And I don't know what it feels like to be a dog in that situation, but there's a resentment, right? Like, there's an anger that other people do not have the fear that some of us have, right? And so, yeah, I'm been honored to hear from people that it's maybe changing their perspective of this sort of psychological topography of fear. Yeah.
I think that's so great. I mean, that you're getting that kind of feedback, that it can actually make some of the men who are not, I mean, I know men are not without fear. That's not fair. I mean, my husband and I have talked about this, but if an intruder came to our house, I mean, he said, I'd be just as scared as you are. Just, I'm a man, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't be scared. And both of us would really like, what do we do? And but it's never happened. So, and I hope it never does. But I think it's great that they're getting this insight into themselves from reading your book.
I mean, Hitchcock had a quote about what frightens us today is the same thing it did yesterday. It's just another wolf. And this idea that we all have different wolves, I think, was always important to me in the book. Like, I'm reconciling with a certain sort of, sort of Little Red Riding Hood style male wolf, but there's also wolves that are hunger, right? Or are these other systemic violences, and, fears of food or housing insecurity, or fears of being undocumented or incarceration, and like, all of those things.
You and I don't have those same fears.
Well, I think it's so important for each of us to consider, as we're sort of moving through the world, to consider, like, what are the fears that are being sold to me and that I'm being told to keep? And are those fears a distraction from other problems? And who is benefiting from my fear, and who is, at what cost am I carrying it, both to the world and myself? I think that's so important.
I guess maybe one last question, or like two important, I think, are important questions, but maybe tell us about your deeply felt connection to OR7, and because we haven't really talked about him that much, and how you felt your lives intersected, and perhaps maybe it would be at what time is it?
We have 10 minutes, so maybe I'll answer a quick OR7 question.
And I was hoping you might read us a little from the book that expands on that connection, but maybe we don't have time for that. But And then I wanted you to talk about how you named the book, how you came to name the book Wolfish. So,
Well,
um,
I'm happy to speak. Yeah. Um, I think that I put OR7 in. OR7 was a famous wolf in Oregon who left his pack and became the first wolf in Western Oregon and then the first wolf in California. And he was a disperser, which is like means he was looking for a mate or territory moving alone. And he became very famous. Newsweek called him the most famous wolf in the world. There was a bumper sticker, OR7 for president. The National Enquirer wrote about him. There were New York Times articles about him. And I think it became this example where I was watching this wolf become a celebrity, wondering like, what is this wolf conjuring for people, right? And the wolf in my book sort of comes in and out of the text. And I think it's important to remember this wolf traveled thousands of miles. It was extraordinary. It lived very long in the wild. It did eventually find a mate, start a pack. But, you know, a lot of wolves do that. And this wolf was just collared. So biologists could see GPS where it was. And I think in the same way, you know, my own experience is relatively standard. Many people could have written a book unwiring their fears and these little moments that shape their relationship with predator and prey and their body and fear. But in a certain way, I'm collaring myself. And I got that line from an interviewer who pointed this out at the Rumpus. It was just such a brilliant observation.
That's great.
Because I thought that's exactly what it is. Like I'm writing about these somewhat quotidian moments at times in the way that so is this wolf, right? The wolf sees something. I just get these little snapshots of both of us. And I think both of us are just bodies who'd left home and we're traveling, and you know, sometimes you fear for them and sometimes you fear them maybe. And so there was this kind of foil. I didn't want him to become a metaphor, but at the same time, I felt like, of course, I'm looking at his life and I'm seeing things in my own. And there's one example where I read that he came really close to the Chips fire, which was a big wildfire in California. And I learned that wolves will sometimes do that. They will go up to a wildfire to catch prey that is fleeing.
Oh,
and that was fascinating to me on a biology level. I didn't know that. And at the same time, like there was a metaphor there of how we sometimes move toward danger if we feel like it's the only way maybe to stay alive, right? And I felt like, of course, I'm going to be looking at that. I ended up putting that section in a context where I'm thinking about why people lie and the idea of sort of like, yeah, desperation leading us to certain things. So I'm both trying to sort of show OR7 in all his wolfish complexity and also think about what it means to be a human watching him.
I felt so connected, I mean, to him in a way I never expected to. I mean, feel close to a wolf. I mean, but you were able to do that in your book, which you I mean, that's one of the gifts of a writer, is to create an experience for us in which we can put ourselves. And I mean, a gifted writer, I should say. And that really, I think you were very much able to do that with OR7 for me. And I think,
well, and I would just, you know, add this idea that his path kind of comes in little drips and drops, and sometimes, you know, there might be a reader that just wishes it was all OR7, and that's the sort of point, is that it can't be. Like, I'm interested in the distance between a wild animal and me, the animal, and sort of how we watch each other, and understanding that he's kind of going to come in and out of sight in the same way that his collar, the signals would come in and out, and so that interplay in the book felt important on a sort of structural level. I'm just seeing a comment. Hi, Liz. I met Liz at a residency too, so it's wonderful to see you here. And commenting on the differences between fears and dangers. Yeah, I think this is really, it's really interesting, and it just makes me think again, like, just because we're afraid of something doesn't mean that they are a threat. Just because we think something is a predator doesn't actually mean
right. Yeah,
they are, right? And there's that project. So this goes to the topic that you brought up, the title, wolfish. Like, wolfish is about a word that humans use to apply to other things very often. My dog is wolfish. This man had a wolfish grin. My sister said that she thought the word conjured a sloppy kiss, which I don't know where that comes from, but there is something kind of too much about the word. And I think that was there's something interesting in that idea that this is a book interested in what do we think we're conjuring when we conjure the wolf to talk about something else, right? I wanted to challenge that. So many of our animal metaphors are fraught and are rooted in not scientific fact. And so at the same time, I think wolfish implies a hunger and a roamingness. The Washington Post review I loved it. It was a lovely essay. I feel so grateful. And one of the things she says is that my approach is kind of like a wolf wandering in and out of different genres. And I do think there's something, researched this book very omnivorously and felt like I was a bit like a wolf going between these sort of highbrow, lowbrow, quoting Amazon reviews, then Claudia Rankine, then Kierkegaard, then I don't know, a song. I probably can't quote a song. They're too expensive.
If I could jump in here, what you're talking about right now leads us to one of our first questions from Mallory Sutton, who says, with Wolfish being a blend of genres, how did you organize your writing research during your journey, and how did you decide where to include historical snippets versus stories of OR7's journey versus personal moments, etc.? Was it intentional or something that came more naturally as you wrote?
It's a wonderful question. It was such a mess of the real serial killer wall, where I had these charts with string where I was charting where OR7 was and where I was in my own life. And I think I was thinking about both of our journeys as this sort of ladder moving through a vast web. And I knew that to do something that felt sort of kaleidoscopic and to look to associatively, I also wanted to have this sort of real life journey that people could come back to. So in each chapter, I knew I was going to have OR7 sort of moving on the map, as well as a different experience in my own life. And I think my agent was the one that said that fear in our own life, or that my own authority talking about fear in my own life with my own body that's a form of authority, right? In the same way that I might go to a scientist and say, here's what fear does, or history, here's a folktale about a wolf. Well, here's an experience where I met a group of men in the trees when I was in college, and I was afraid. And
that was such a creepy.
That's a relevant story. And so I was having trouble thinking. At first, I didn't want to put myself in. I felt like my experiences are too quotidian. They're not headline worthy, really. And then I realized that was the point. We live with this sort of sedimentary experiences that accumulate. And so seeing my own story as a form of authority. So I would say I then had this chart where I had OR7, my life. I knew I wanted to teach something about the biology, the reality of being a wolf, a physical wolf in each chapter. So I would sort of slot in where that would go. And then also to have sort of these symbolic wolves through time and space. So I plotted it out, and I think thought of each chapter as kind of a bucket where I was going to have that concoction of various elements.
Oh,
but it took years.
I was going to say,
how long did it take?
I first wrote the first version of this for my environmental studies thesis in 2014. And so that was very much looking at the wolf as a real wolf. There was hardly any symbolic wolves in that. And then I would say my MFA thesis a few years later was almost entirely symbolic wolves, because I was really, many of you may have this who are writers, there's one story you think you want to tell, and then there's the story you keep writing anyway. And I was so fixated on fear in my own life at that point, all I could write about was this sort of symbolic wolf. And then I think the third version in my mind was this kind of merging of them. But that was all in all, it's been almost 10 years since I first started studying wolves. So a lot of marinating.
Wow. We have another question here from Emma Huddleston, apologies. She says, I love the intergenerational friendship between these two writers. And what you both write about is also intergenerational, terror and love. How have intergenerational friendships influenced your writing?
I love that question. And hi, Emma. I think that I am close to my family, but also very aware of the lineage we inherit of stories and lessons, right? And I think and also silences, right? We inherit as many stories as we inherit silences, and all of those things become these catalysts to look at. And, you know, like with Sharon, I felt like I would be asking these questions. Like sometimes it becomes a good, almost a fact check where it's easy to slip into a generalization. Like, this is what it's like for me to be a young woman. And Sharon would go, whoa, that's not how it was for me when I was your age, right? And like, there's something there that's just a constant perspective widening, which I think is so essential, especially in this realm of kind of cultural criticism, to have these different voices and different perspectives, both in sort of chosen and biological family. And for me, you know, the book actually ends where I'm thinking about what is security in the face of fear, and understanding that it wasn't a nuclear family for me. And I actually look at wolf packs that have step families and they have foster families. They're called complex wolf packs, where they sort of spread outward and have different members. And I realized that sort of in my life, my connections, these nodes of support that make me feel less afraid in the world, it's a very intergenerational web. And I say that as someone who doesn't have children, you know, yet, or it's, yeah, that web of connection. I think there's something that is, it's a bolstering against fear, I guess.
And we can have families of choice, and you're very much part of my family of choice, and you always will be.
Oh, very mutual.
It's a very rich friendship, and probably surprising a little bit to both of us, I think, but it will go on and on and on, I hope.
I hope so too. I think so. On and off the page.
On the page.
I'm just seeing this note from Sharon. I know it's 5 o'clock, but this question about what have you learned about from this creative process that might bridge the many gulfs that separate us? I think that is such a lovely question. And I think I came into this issue not, I'm very non-confrontational, and I did not know that wolf issues were controversial at the time. And somebody said, be careful, a journalist just got a death threat talking about wolves in Eastern Oregon. And I thought, oh gosh, well, I'll just go in there and like hear all the facts and we'll sort this out. And of course, it's not that simple, right? But at the same time, so many people have opened their doors and wanted to sit down and talk. And I think
that's because you're somebody who's so open and welcoming and easy to talk to. That's a big part of it, I think.
Well, yeah, and I think that muscle, you know, Rebecca Solnit writes about how hope is a muscle that doesn't always feel easy. And I think at the same time, an openness and a curiosity and I will listen to you, not always easy, not always pleasant, or, you know, there would be moments where I wouldn't be sure whether to correct the person I was talking to if they brought up maybe a political thing that was the wrong, it was unfactual. And yet what we're here to talk about wolves, we're here to talk about the representation of wolves. And I was navigating in those moments, but ultimately listening and staying maybe for a couple days with some of these people, and they were listening to me too, right? And I think like these sort of conversations and understanding that it's not urban versus rural, it's not civilization versus wild or wolf versus dog. Like this book is in so many ways an effort to break down the binaries that divide us and that we sort of cling to simplify our lives. And yet I think if we can have that reflex of like, what if this isn't a binary? What if I cross it? What is waiting on that side? Not out of naivete, but just like curiosity as much as anything. You know, a young wolf is born afraid, but like we'll go inquire if they hear something. And I think that idea that sometimes our unease might not be a door closing, but it might be a door opening, and we can sort of like follow that.
We have a couple of questions that we'll get to wrap this up. One actually is for both of you. It's from Lynn Oliver, and she says, your book sounds fascinating and operates on many layers of symbolism, and it's a privilege to hear your conversation with Sharon. During this Zoom, I was recalling the famous book from 1992, Women Who Run with Wolves, which deals with wolves, women's psychological development, feminism, spirituality. And it felt like your book in some ways is in dialogue with that book, at least historically. Can you and Sharon comment?
Sharon, I'd be curious, we must have talked about that right away. Did you have experiences?
No, I don't remember talking about that, but it seems obvious, doesn't it? I want you to talk about it. You talk about it.
I mean, I think that book
Lynn,
is
to the question.
so foundational in terms of thinking through these archetypes and also thinking about the wolf as the woman or the wolf inside, which was so compiling these stories from around the world in such a beautiful way. And to be totally honest, I have not read through the whole book, and I've had this experience with other people. It's this tome, right? It's super impressive. I could grab it on my shelf right now. And so I certainly, it's funny because Barry Lopez's book Of Wolves and Men was also this foundational text about wolves and humans that won the book award in 1971, I think, the National Book Award. And it's funny, you have like women who run with wolves and men, and like they're almost in conversation. And I felt like entering a canon where there are so many wolf books, I never wanted to. One of the reasons I include quotes in this book is because, and I talk about, both of those books or reference them, is that I feel like I'm trying to show how I come to a certain thought now, which is 50 years after that, 40 years after that. Almost the way in long division and math, we were taught to like show our steps. I want to make obvious sort of how my thinking evolves and how here's where Barry Lopez ends. And here's what's happened with climate change since then, or with police brutality, and here's how we have to extend these conversations into the future. And so I very much see those as sort of stepping stones, and entering a canon that is as sort of full of bestsellers as the wolf book. I never wanted to try to like beat them out or write another kind of wolf book. It was like, how can I be in conversation? I guess I have a real pleasure with that idea of joining writers I admire in conversation.
Good answer.
I
We
think
have one last question. Sorry, Sharon.
no, go ahead. I was just going to
No,
say,
please
I think
weigh
your
in.
book is resonant, but quite different. I mean, and the generations, you're coming from a different place, but they all work together, all of these books. I mean, it's not like one is the best and one is, lesser than. The wolf is obviously a powerful, both metaphor and real entity that commands interest and attention from writers, and will probably continue to.
Well, and because we all have our own wolf, we all have our own conception of what that wolf is. I think, I hope there's many more wolf books. I think everyone here could write a wolf essay about the wolves in their own life, both physical and maybe imagined, that would be really rich. And so I wanted in some way to like make space for those perspectives on the page.
My niece's young daughter, who may be watching tonight, I don't know, but maybe someday, she's 11 now, I think she's 11, and she'll be writing a book about wolves, and somebody will be asking her about how does your book relate to Erica Berry's book Wolfish? Like Lynn wanted to know about women who run with the wolves. It's
Right. Well, we have one last question, and that's from Susan Lord, and she says, in answer to how to prepare our daughters for the world, I'll be giving her your book, which is a wonderful compliment. The complexity and richness of this story in all its many facets of real life, archetype, and culture is touching and impressive. Like Sharon, I can't wait to see what's next for you. What have you learned about from this creative process that might bridge the many gulfs that separate us so profoundly? That's a big question to ask somebody, but go ahead, Erica.
I think I did see this in the chat and sort of alluded to it earlier. Susan, thank you for this question and for thinking about this book. I mean, I do think like understanding that I think the fear does have to be talked about is one of these things. I think I had many talks with my parents as we were sort of reading. They were reading early drafts, and some of those conversations not about what's on the page, but what's not on the page, right? And understanding like, did we prepare you enough? Like even this question of like, why were you so anxious? Was it our fault? I don't think they felt that, but of course it's maybe what a parent asks when their child is hypervigilant. You're like, am I responsible for this? And I think understanding that there has to be a space to talk into that darkness and that frustration, and giving room to those fears. You know, I had an experience in Sicily where I was
Oh,
potentially harmed someone else. We had a accidental poisoning situation where I became aware of harm that I had caused, even though I was not intending to. And I think those moments are also so important for parents to talk about with their children, regardless of gender identity, right? Like, when were you, maybe you scared someone else, you hurt someone else, you didn't mean to. Those are hard moments to talk about too, but this goes back to like Little Red Riding Hood. The story is not just like how to keep yourself safe, but how to make other people feel safe. And so I think hopefully
how
there's
to
an,
know yourself more deeply, you know,
yeah,
which is the gift you're giving us in this book. I think you're showing us how you've learned to know yourself more deeply.
yeah,
And that's a challenge for every person in this world, and some will
Mhm.
take it and some will not. And you're offering it to us, and thank you very much for that, for doing that. It's a
Thank you
really,
both, and thank you all for
And
coming.
thank you. Thanks to both of you. Sharon, thank you for bringing Erica here and
aren't you
enjoying the
happy I did
conversation.
that? Aren't you
I'm
happy?
absolutely thrilled. We're thrilled. We're very excited. Our booksellers are very excited about this book. I did the book a little bit of a disservice in that I did not read the subtitle when I introduced you. It is actually Wolfish, Wolf, Self, and the Stories We Tell About Fear. And it is available at oblongbooks.com along with Sharon's collections of poetry and her essay collection. Thank you all for spending your evening with us. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Erica, for a wonderful discussion. We hope you had an enjoyable evening, and thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you
And
so
with
much,
that,
Oblong, and thank you, Sharon. Look forward to
Namaste.
more of our talks as we're walking around. Good
I love you.
good night. Good night, everyone.
Good
night. Thank you.
night. Namaste.
Thank you.